At lunchtime came the news that Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists had supported the Russians. This was enough to sway quite a number of Cubans. Then dusk began to draw in the population mustered around the TV sets. I forget now where I watched the lengthy tirade in which Fidel Castro ended all utopian babble about Cuba following a different course from the sclerotic Stalinists in the Kremlin. But I think it was the same pink-facaded Hotel Nacional where Graham Greene's sadistic Captain Segura once received a cold blast of soda water in the face and shouted, "Kono," before he could stop himself. As the speech of the bearded one wore on, the faces of some of my comrades began to take on a startled and upset, cold shower look as well, and by the end of it, as the routine standing ovation of the Central Committee was being shown, the argument in our ranks was already underway. Apart from those few who stubbornly thought that Castro had done and said the right thing by taking the Brezhnev line, the main division was between those who thought he had acted under duress and those who felt he was expressing his real ideological kinship. I thought it could be both. It could well be both. It was obvious that Cuban communism depended upon Soviet oil and weapons to survive, but even had this not been so, Castro in his speech had been frigidly unsympathetic to the desire of the Czechoslovaks to live a life that was more open to the market economy, more attuned to the culture of the United States, and more adapted to the open societies of Western Europe. Once more making the stern attempt to be dialectical about this, I think I concluded, without actually admitting it to myself, that Castroism might still have a point in Latin America and the Caribbean, where monstrously reactionary dictatorships like those of Brazil and Nicaragua and Haiti were still undergirded by cynical American power. However, in more advanced Europe, the impulses of a revolutionary left could and should be used to erode the Berlin Wall from both sides. There were a number of brave Trotskyists among the Czech resistance, after all led by the heroic Peter Uhl. Anyway, I do not completely hate myself for attempting this book balancing, and I can say with some pride that our small international socialist contingent in Havana managed to receive a rolled-up tube of a special edition of Socialist Worker from London by the way of mail, and that this edition was headed to big, bold, black capitals, "Russians, get out of Czechoslovakia." To have handed this out in Cuba during a world crisis was for me a matter of socialist honor and gave me an irrepressible sense of participating in a genuinely historic moment. It seemed so clear that the ossified, torpid, communist systems and parties had committed a kind of political and moral suicide by their Panzerkommunismus, Ernst Fischer's acid phrase, conduct in Prague. Yet this seemed to offer a chance that in France, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in the yet-to-be liberated territories of the Third World, the brave Soixante Hutards were clearing the way for the real and authentic left to emerge at last. The long-delayed Czech charter flight almost failed to clear the palm trees at the fringe of Havana airport, something to do with a wrong guess about the weight of the luggage, but the expressions of the crew conveyed a general listless attitude. They were returning to a country where the state-decreed slogan was that of post-invasion normalization, one of the most casually ugly phrases of the whole 20th century. Once again, we had a stopover in Canada, and on the TV screens saw the Chicago police beating puddles of blood out of the demonstrators who were willing to pit themselves against a filthy war, a racist Democratic Party machine, and a fixed convention. Damn it, I remember thinking, I have missed Prague and now I'm missing Chicago. Tourist of the Revolution was a phrase that was later used to ridicule those who went in search of socialist fatherlands. But I truly did not think of myself as a tourist. I simply and exhaustingly and fervently wished I could be in many places at once, so as to lean the uttermost of my slight weight into the fulcrum. It was years later that I read Thomas Paine saying that to have played a part in 2 revolutions was to have lived to some purpose. This was the sort of eloquence that I wished I could have commanded at the time. However, I was still somewhat imprisoned within the jargon of the left sectarianism. By the time our plane had landed in London, with the Czechs continuing morosely homeward, and myself being subjected to yet another police scrutiny of my passport and my person, the new post-Chicago headline of Socialist Worker read like this: East and West, tanks and cops defend freedom. To a point, I approved this moral equivalence. It was at any rate better than those who only moaned painlessly about Prague, which the West had not defended, or those who were only moved to protest about Vietnam. The verbal crudeness of the headline's phrasing bothered me less than it should have done. After all, as our plane had neared London, we had been told that one of our number might possibly be detained and even deported upon arrival. He was a South African exile. Nothing more needed to be said. We all knew that we would form a cluster around him, pile our luggage into the shape of a barricade, raise our fists, and utter the most obvious chants of resistance until we could be sure that a proper left-wing lawyer had arrived. The risk of our own detention or blacklisting would have been nothing more than the payment of a duty. Had you then accused me of being sloganistic in my politics, I would have considered it no great insult. As 1968 began to ebb into 1969, however, and as anticlimax began to become a real word in my lexicon, another term began to obtrude itself. People began to intone the words, "The personal is political." At the instant I first heard this deadly expression, I knew, as one does from the utterance of any sinister bullshit, that it was, cliché, is arguably forgivable here, very bad news. From now on, it would be enough to be a member of a sex or gender or epidermal subdivision or even erotic preference to qualify as a revolutionary. In order to begin a speech or ask a question from the floor, all that would be necessary by way of preface would be the words, "speaking as a," then could follow any self-loving description. I will have to say this much for the old hard left. We earned our claim to speak and intervene by right of experience and sacrifice and work. It would never have done for any of us to stand up and say that our sex or sexuality or pigmentation or disability were qualifications in themselves. There are many ways of dating the moment when the left lost, or I would prefer to say, discarded its moral advantage. But this was the first time that I was to see the sellout conducted so cheaply. Back in Oxford, I ran into the warden in High Street. He was very much his usual self, bustling and brimming and half deferential, half ironic. "My dear Christopher, just the man I wanted to tell. We have a new fellow coming into the college, a new recruit, as you would probably say, but a hero, an absolute hero. Bit of a Marxist, I'm afraid, but it can't be helped. You must meet him." This was my introduction to Leszek Kolakowski, who was then not much known outside his native Poland. He had been one of the Reform Communists, intellectuals of the Polish Spring of 1956, a moment that had inaugurated a period of relative openness under the Gomulka regime. The reactionary and anti-Jewish crackdown of 1968 presaged the arrest and imprisonment of Kuron and Modzelewski, had put all this into reverse. Kolakowski had, like so many of the intellectual leadership of Eastern Europe, been partly deported and partly self-exiled. He had at first gone to teach philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley, a campus whose name was near sacred to those of us who felt we were breathing the pure air of the 60s, but had eventually tired of this already and was willing to come to All Souls. Kolakowski had missed his formal education because of the Nazi occupation of his country, but had more than made up for it by the hungry ingestion of books during the wartime underground years, during which time he had also become a consecrated communist. When we eventually met, I was first of all, and perhaps rather foolishly, impressed by how exactly he looked his part. Victor Laszlo in Casablanca simply seems too sleek and well-fed to have been a survivor of Nazi penal institutions. I still shudder when I think how nearly Ronald Reagan came to being cast as Rick in that movie. But Leszek had had the ideally gaunt, austere appearance of the dissident who has known what it is to suffer material as well as intellectual deprivation. His voice and manner also were appropriately ironic and sardonic, and he had, in effect, seen all the way through communism. In my boyish way, I thought I had done the same, but I cannot tell you how much this argument used to matter. I would not concede that Leninism and Stalinism were the same thing, or that second logically followed from the first. After much wrestling and juggling, Kolakowski had simply given up on the whole idea of reform communism, or was at any rate in the throes of doing so. I did not believe that Stalin's system could be reformed, but I was quite convinced that it could and would only be overturned by and from the left. Kolakowski was quite patient with me at the time, and how embarrassing I now find it to say this. I thought that it was I who was being quite indulgent to him. The Polish ambassador to London, a doltish apparatchik named Marian Dobrylski, was invited to Oxford to give a talk. With the help of some Polish leftist friends to act as translators for the Polish press on file at St. Anthony's College, I managed to draft and print a leaflet in Polish and English, telling the Stalinist envoy that he was not welcome. I asked Kolakowski if he'd come to the event and help to swell our protest. He declined, saying rather dryly that there was little point in such commonplace encounters. We went ahead anyway and gave Ambassador Dobrylski quite a bad time, and just as the evening was breaking up, I saw a bony and quizzical visage peering from a dark corner at the back of the hall. Lezek had not, after all, been able to resist showing up. At the time, I thought that this was a small triumph for Trotskyism over mere anti-communism. In fact, Kolakowski was just beginning to erect the edifice of his astonishing trilogy, Main Currents of Marxism. I was fabulously lucky in having met him so early, but much too callow and overconfident to take full advantage of the chance I'd been given. Still, for almost the next 2 decades of my life, I carried on an argument with him, and others like him, about the nature of communism. Yes, the germ of Stalinism had been in Leninism to begin with, but had there not been other germs as well? And what historical conditions led to the dominance of which germs? I suppose I still hope to show that not everything about this debate was a complete waste of time. The remainder of my golden Oxford years slid by in this way, and, though I was oppressed at the time by a sense of waste that my fellow Balliol man, Anthony Powell, had called the crushing melancholy of the undergraduate condition, I did not believe that they were entirely squandered either. Let us say 1/4 of the time allotted to political confrontations and dramas, another devoted to reading books on any subject except the ones I was supposed to be studying, another 1/4 on seeking out intellectual heavyweights who commanded artillery superior to my own, with the residual 25% being consumed by the polymorphous perverse. It could have been worse. I made a minor discovery which has been useful to me since the analysis of some larger public figures, like my contemporary Bill Clinton. If you can give a decent speech in public, or cut any kind of figure on the podium, then you need never dine or sleep alone. I was actually a bit more confident on the platform than I was in the sack, and I can remember losing my virginity a bit later than most of my peers, I suspect with a girl who, inviting me to tea at one of the then segregate female colleges, allowed me to notice that her walls were covered with photographs taken of me by an unseen cameraman who'd followed my public career. Since apparently I could do no wrong with this young lady. There came also a day when the undergraduate weekly Cherwell asked me if I would like to help write the John Evelyn gossip column. This was a prestige spot, disapproved of by some in my grimmer and less hedonistic comrades, but a perfect finesse of that problem offered itself at once. I was to be co-author of the column with Patrick Cockburn, whose father, Claude, a red veteran of the Spanish Civil War, had been one of the great guerrilla journalists of all time. Had been? In the London offices of the great satirical magazine Private Eye, he still was a figure of immense authority. His oldest son, Alexander, had left Oxford to become one of the editors of the New Left Review, and his middle son, Andrew, an arrestingly handsome boy with a look reminiscent of the young T.S. Eliot, was another of my contemporaries. Anybody who knows anything about the later history of the radical journalism will recognize these names, as they will that of the great documentary maker Christo Hurd, who became the third member of our John Evelyn team and helped us transform it from a mere chronicle of idle and gilded youth into something more mordant and investigative and Swiftian, or so we like to think. Once again, that lure of printer's ink and the word pamphleteer. I had better confess before quitting this to having it both ways moment that gave me, even at the time, a twinge of remorse. When Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger circumvented Congress and the Constitution and the strategic majority of Nixon's own cabinet in 1970 in order to conduct the invasion of Cambodia, I had already been invited to debate with the then Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart at the Oxford Union on the morality of the war in Indochina. The obscene images of the conflict, as they were extended to yet another country, were so enraging that I banished all thoughts of scruple. I accepted the formal invitation to take part in the debate and to attend the dinner beforehand with the Foreign Secretary. Meanwhile, I intrigued with friends to make sure that there was a large claque of hardcore protesters stationed in the main hall and in the gallery. I made my speech from the dispatch box in the approved manner. It wasn't one of my best, but it made a fairly fierce and detailed case against the imperial incursion, and then loudly insulted the government's guest of honor, deserted the other guest, and went to sit with and shout with the mob. At a given signal, when Stewart rose to speak, a phalanx also rose and simply and repetitively yelled the one word, murderer, in his face. It was horribly gratifying to see the way in which the leading member of Her Majesty's government had turned so pale under the assault. At another signal, a noose was uncurled from the gallery and fell dangling within inches of the wretched Foreign Secretary's head. It was dropped by James Long, later to be a distinguished economics editor at the BBC. Nobody had ever attempted to abort a debate in these precincts before, and so the pitifully weak staff of the building was at a loss. We could have done almost anything we wanted, including at least roughing up, if not lynching, the Foreign Secretary. A sudden consciousness of exactly this ability, both intoxicating and nauseating, is probably what stalled us. We contented ourselves with further deafening insults and marched away. The official minute book of our little parliament still records that, for the first time in the 147 years of society's existence, the House voted to stand adjourned sine die on account of riot. The publicity was astounding. An editorial in the Times opined that our movement of protest was one of the nastiest political phenomena that Britain has experienced in this century, which I thought, when one considered only a few of the other phenomena, was plainly absurd. We had, in our own opinion, not silenced Mr. Stewart, whose views were well known and could easily be broadcast, so much as we had voiced the outrage that should properly be felt at the destruction of Cambodian society. I remember arguing with dexterous casuistry that we had compelled the establishment press to take notice, and had thus, in a way, actually succeeded in enlarging the area of free speech. A nice try, I hope you will admit, but however one phrased that case, the only reason for mentioning free speech in the first place was that, however one looked at it, we had in fact shut down a public debate by force. I had a huge quarrel about it with Jack Straw, then the head of the National Union of Students and a strong opponent of the Vietnam War, who insisted that the right of free expression trumped all other considerations. It was years before we agreed on anything again, and by that time he was himself the Foreign Secretary for Tony Blair, and arguing that the United Nations for the removal of the intolerable Saddam Hussein tyranny from Iraq. I remember how we arrived at higher synthesis, a final justification of our breach of the rules of civility, debate, and hospitality. After all, we had, did we not, a higher cause and nobler purpose? It was even possible, given the huge media fuss generated by our action, that the people of Indochina would get to hear of it and, as a result, take additional heart from the knowledge of our solidarity. As I write this, I realize that I then truly did believe it. After a mighty demonstration outside the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, Michael Rosen had written a haunting poem, published in the university's literary magazine, Isis. That hymned and then famous poster of a Vietnamese woman in a paddy field with a gun slung over her shoulder. Please let it be, the poem had urged, that some of the news and pictures of our revolt will reach you and put a smile on your face. Next to this imperative, we felt, all lesser reservations were merely pallid and insipid. So quite hardened as I was to insisting on this point against those who were more tentative, why was it that I could not quite suppress the sense of having done something shabby? I have something to expiate, as D.H. Lawrence put it in his poem, Snake, a pettiness.